The Wars of the Roses were fought in the Kingdom of England between the supporters of two major dynasties of royal descent, the House of Lancaster and the House of York. For reasons that are far too intensely complicated and confusing to explain here, the country underwent a political crisis in the mid-15th century that allowed the Yorkists to challenge the ruling Lancastrians, then headed by King Henry VI. After a lot of fighting, the House of York succeeded in deposing Henry, and the head of the Yorkists took the throne as King Edward IV. However, Edward was unable to resolve the crisis, and when he died in 1483 he left an infant son, also called Edward, to rule the country, as King Edward V. Both Edward V and his younger brother were then deposed and disappeared by the former king's brother Richard, who took the throne as the notorious King Richard III. However, Richard's actions triggered a number of rebellions, one of which successfully managed to kill him and bring Henry Tudor to the throne as King Henry VII. Although this is an overly simplistic representation of the wars, the drama and high stakes of the conflict have inspired a number of writers, one of which was George R.R. Martin, the creator of A Game of Thrones. It's no secret that a number of characters and events within the series are based upon actual people from history. The majority of them were from the Wars of the Roses, although a few are from slightly later and earlier periods. As I've been producing a series on the Wars of the Roses, I thought I should create a little video explaining who all these different people were. If this episode achieves nothing else, it would at the very least demonstrate to you how well Martin researched the period, considering how some of the characters he created are based upon some seriously obscure figures. It's also worth noting that GRRM has stated that several of his characters possess multiple real-life influences. Others are broadly similar to historical figures, but have had certain aspects of their personalities massively exaggerated for dramatic purposes. Quick note on spoilers. This episode is going to be mainly focused on the TV series, up to episode 7 of series 5. While the books will be mentioned, this will be limited as I've only managed to read A Game of Thrones and A Clash of Kings. Yeah, I know, I should read the rest or whatever, but they're hundreds of pages long, and making these episodes take a long time, so get off my case. In terms of which characters we're going to be covering, we'll be looking at the major houses of Westeros during the time frame of the series, with the exception of Arryn and Martell, because they are virtually non-existent and haven't been seen very much respectively. The Greyjoys and Tullys will also not be included here, because neither house receives a lot of focus, and because they don't have any proper analogues. Should this episode prove to be popular, I may make some more covering the other characters in the series. Straight off the bat, I want to get something out of the way. The houses of Stark and Lannister are name-only XPs of the houses of York and Lancaster. They share no similarities with either real-world house beyond their names being vaguely sort of similar, like if you squinted your eyes and tried to read them after drinking a bottle of JD similar. However, the House of York does have a counterpart in A Game of Thrones. My fave house, the Baratheons. In general, the three brothers Baratheon are based off the latter days of the House of York, largely due to the way that their politics are defined by the relations between three brothers, and that they constantly argue with each other. The eldest of the Baratheon brothers, Robert, is based upon the most successful member of the House of York, King Edward IV. Actually, based on is a bit of an understatement. Completely lifted is probably more correct. Both took the throne through military conquest under questionable legality from a king suffering from madness. Both were also considered unparalleled military commanders during their lives, with King Edward never losing a single battle. Likewise, Robert's negative characteristics are also copied from Edward. Both were never truly effective politicians and repeatedly failed to shore up their dynasty's power, maintaining their hold on the throne largely through military prowess more than anything else. Likewise, both gained a reputation for debauchery, primarily through constant womanizing, drinking, and gluttony. Both also faced military rebellions at roughly the same time during their reigns, although Edward's was significantly more of a threat compared with the half-baked stupidity of the Greyjoy Rebellion. Their deaths are also similar. Both died unexpectedly, and their demise created a succession crisis. As for the other two Baratheons, Stannis and Renly, they aren't quite as clear-cut as Robert. Personality-wise, Stannis isn't based upon anyone from the Wars of the Roses. However, the circumstances in which he takes the throne are quite similar to what happened in the months subsequent to Edward's death. After Edward died, the crown passed to his son, also called Edward. However, Edward IV's ambitious brother Richard had both of the heirs declared bastards and took the throne for himself. In this sense, Stannis' attempt on the throne is an inverted version of this scenario. Robert's children in Game of Thrones really are bastards, and hence Stannis is the heir. As for Renly, he is a composite character. Much of his personality is based upon another of Edward IV's brothers, George, Duke of Clarence. Both have a tendency of just playing at intrigue and dynastic disputes, and end up being eliminated by far more hard-nosed opponents. Renly's decision to rebel against his elder brother in A Clash of Kings is reminiscent of Richard's usurpation of the throne after Edward IV's death, in the sense that both break inheritance law and override close male relatives out of a belief that they will be a better ruler. The consequences of this are identical in both A Game of Thrones and the Wars of the Roses. All Renly and Richard achieved in the end was splitting their own forces and helping their enemies take the throne. Said enemies in A Game of Thrones are the Baratheons of King's Landing. Baratheons here being written with inverted commas so huge they block out the fucking sun. Anywho, Joffrey is king for much of the series and shares a number of traits with another royal. And no, it was not Prince Edward, King Henry VI's son, though he will come up later. Instead, Joffrey is most similar to King Richard II, who ruled England about 60-odd years before the Wars of the Roses began. The most obvious aspect of the comparison is that both look virtually identical, something that is more prominent in the books, where Joffrey is considerably taller, making him a dead ringer for Richard II, who is described as being tall, blonde, attractive and lanky. Personality-wise, Richard may have suffered from some form of narcissistic personality disorder, something that Joffrey definitely doesn't have in any way, shape or form. Likewise, both did not take advice particularly well and had a tendency towards murdering powerful nobles without properly thinking through the political consequences. Meanwhile, Joffrey's younger brother Tommen, who takes the throne after Joffrey suffers an unfortunate poisoning accident, is largely based upon King Henry VI. Henry unfortunately suffered from being all too nice in a world where being brutally violent was required of his position. Tommen has the same problem. Don't get me wrong, it's great that he has a cat called Sir Pounce, but are you seriously expecting a person like that to be capable of running a realm that Roose Bolton and Littlefinger live in? Already, Tommen is being controlled by his wife, a fate that Henry VI was all too familiar with. As for Myrcella, well, she was put on a boat in Season 2, we haven't seen much of her since then, so we're going to have to wait and see. Continuing on the subject of kings, let's back up the timeline a bit to Robert's Rebellion. The king at the start of that particular war was King Aerys II, known more commonly in the series as the Mad King. Aerys was once a competent and even respected ruler, but latent paranoid and schizophrenic tendencies evolved into full-blown insanity after he was imprisoned by a rebellious lord in the Defiance of Duskendale. By the time of Robert's Rebellion, Aerys' madness had become so acute that he had murdered several prominent lords in unpleasant circumstances, prompting the houses of Baratheon, Stark, Tully and Arryn to raise their banners in a rebellion. Aerys' debilitating madness and the disastrous effects it had upon his kingdom is reminiscent of two famously mad kings from the later Middle Ages. King Charles VI, the Mad of France, and his grandson and ruler of England, King Henry VI. Charles suffered from psychosis, a form of mental illness that likely had been passed down from his mother, Joanna of Bourbon. The first bout afflicted him while he was leading an expedition against one of his enemies. While his party crossed a field, a tired squire accidentally dropped a lance. When the lance clattered to the ground, Charles suddenly began screaming that he was surrounded by traitors and managed to hack 4 of his friends to death before he could be brought under control. He continued to suffer delusional and psychotic episodes throughout his life, such as thinking he was St. George or made of glass, which was only exacerbated by being nearly burned to death during a horrendous accident at a masquerade ball that has gone down in history as the Ball of Burning Men. On the other hand, King Henry's madness was significantly more benign, mostly manifesting itself in delusional thoughts and catatonic states. However, both kings' incapacity to rule caused civil war within their kingdoms in much the same way as happened in A Game of Thrones. However, King Aerys was not alone in Robert's Rebellion. Much of the actual day-to-day commanding of his forces was left in the hands of his son, Prince Rhaegar, who in turn has his own inspiration from the Wars of the Roses in the form of King Henry VI's son, Prince Edward. Like Rhaegar, Edward was considered to be a significantly more effective leader than his father, and eventually came to be a rallying point for his faction. However, Prince Edward was killed at the Battle of Tewkesbury by forces commanded by King Edward IV, just as Rhaegar was killed at the Battle of the Trident by King Edward's analogue, Robert Baratheon. Their deaths not only effectively ended their respective factions, but also caused both figures to gain the status of kings that never were. But the kings that defeated the two princes did not gain their throne through birth. No, they were made kings, with the assistance of two very powerful people. In real life, King Edward IV only won his throne through the efforts of Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, more commonly known by his nickname Warwick the Kingmaker. Tywin Lannister is Warwick's copy in A Game of Thrones. Both are immensely wealthy, effective politicians and have heavily invested in propping up the kings they helped win. However, one key difference between the two is that Robert scrupulously kept Tywin on side by marrying his daughter and offering his family preferential treatment. King Edward IV did no such thing and repeatedly antagonised Warwick, culminating in Warwick mounting 2 rebellions against Edward of varying degrees of effectiveness. Tywin's daughter Cersei has her own influences in the Wars of the Roses as well, being a composite of 2 queens, Margaret of Anjou and Elizabeth Woodville. Margaret of Anjou married Henry VI and ended up being the real power behind the throne, gaining a reputation for fanatically protecting her son and attacking her enemies whenever the opportunity presented itself. Any fan will recognise these traits as being present in Cersei, although Margaret was nowhere near as mentally unstable as Cersei is. Elizabeth Woodville, the wife of King Edward IV, appears to be the second major inspiration for Cersei. Both had a reputation of being incredibly beautiful, both used their positions to elevate their family to privileged positions, and both found their husbands continually interested in another woman. For Elizabeth, this other woman was Jane Shaw. For Cersei, it was Lyanna Stark. Speaking of the Starks, they really are the odd ones out here. Despite being a major characters throughout the series, the Starks as a whole don't have any counterparts in real history, other than being generic stand-ins for England's notoriously restive northern lords. The only individual in the Stark family that I can link to a person from real history is Eddard Stark, who has a number of similarities with Sir Humphrey Stafford, the Duke of Buckingham and an influential figure in the first part of the wars. Stafford's conduct over the opening moves of the wars gained him a reputation for even-mindedness and a determination to defend King Henry VI, not because he believed in him as a leader, but because he was his king. His death also mirrors Eddard's. Both were betrayed by a subordinate who was tempted by promises of wealth and slaughtered by their enemies while trying to defend their king in a last stand. Beyond that, the House of Stark has no real analogue, probably because if any dynasty in the medieval period attempted to abide by honour as strictly as the Starks do, they would have been wiped out very quickly. However, the significantly more astute Tyrell family are, as a whole, very clearly inspired by the real-life House of Tudor, to the point of having a virtually identical sigil. The Tyrells have their power base in the south and have a reputation of being a bit of a dark horse, both things that could be said to have belonged to the Tudors as well. However, what really makes the similarity so striking is the two houses' approach to politics. While both the Tudors and Tyrells possess significant military and economic might, neither was particularly well known for warmongering. Instead, they consolidate their power through achieving popular assent, being masters of PR. As for individual figures within the Tyrells, some can be matched up with figures from the wider Tudor dynasty. Olenna Tyrell, aka the Queen of Thorns, is very clearly inspired by Henry VII's mother, Margaret Beaufort. Both occupied a position as matriarch of the family in the absence of male leadership. Both were extremely effective politicians, and both were afforded far more power by their sons than would be usually expected of their positions. However, it's worth noting that Henry VII was just as an effective politician as his mother, making the pair of them English history's greatest power couple. As for Olenna's son Mace, he has a few parallels with Henry VII's son, King Henry VIII. They look visually similar, have a reputation for hunting and merrymaking, and have a tendency to get involved in slightly harebrained and unnecessary wars. However, in other respects, Mace comes across as a cartoonish exaggeration of Henry VIII's pop culture reputation. Mace lacks the real Henry's political acumen. I just want to talk about one last thing before we finish up here. There's a very interesting little factoid relating to the Tyrells. After King Edward IV's death, Richard III usurped the throne and had Edward's two sons confined to the Tower of London. The two princes were then murdered in very mysterious circumstances. Up until quite recently, historians suspected one man of actually doing the deed. This man's name? James Tyrell. Considering that the Tyrells pull off their own prince murdering in a Game of Thrones, if this naming was intentional, then hats off to Martin for creating a phenomenally obscure in-joke. This brings this little episode to an end, but if you're interested in finding out more about the history of the Wars of the Roses, please feel free to check out the series I have on my channel about it.